You may have noticed the world has gone kind of nutty. The last few years have been quite the roller coaster ride for those of you who are old enough to know that the way the world is right now isn't exactly normal. And you don't have to adhere to any one political ideology or another, or be a really religious person or whatever, to really notice that the world seems to have gone off the rails and things are just getting a little weird out there. And a lot of people posit a number of issues that could be to blame for it, and certainly the general state of society is what we call in policy circles a wicked problem. A wicked problem is one of those that has so many different dimensions to it that it is nearly impossible to solve. And I think calling it a wicked problem is probably accurate. We have a new study that really does shed some light on this. It's a study that links the consumption of ultra-processed foods to psychosocial problems. Meaning what we see going on in the world right now. Name an issue out in this broader culture where things just have gone off the rails in the last few years, and to a degree, consumption of ultra-processed foods are contributing to it because it's unbalancing people's mental well-being. Of course, there are other things feeding into this as well, and I'm sure you can put some of them in the comments below if you so wish. But my purpose here is not to talk about partisan issues or anything else. We're going to talk about ultra-processed foods because ultra-processed foods are not a good thing for people to consume. Now, before we go over this study, I do want to mention one thing. Here's a little bit of a caveat. You're going to hear them define nutrients, like nutrient-rich foods, as being high in protein and fiber. I'm curious how fiber is considered a nutrient. What essential nutrients does fiber have? No one's ever been able to explain that. It's why it's one of our favorite go-to catchphrases in low-carb circles to really combat the claim that you need carbs to thrive. And you're going to hear some claims against processed meats. And while certainly you probably shouldn't eat a whole lot of hot dogs and sandwich meat, as a general rule, it's not necessarily they're not by far the worst thing. The powers that be want you to think that eating processed meats are the worst thing. And I don't want you to think that I'm endorsing that view. Eat your bacon if you want to eat your bacon. It's fine. But let's go over this anyway because there's something really revealing here. So the summary of this that I'm going to give you, because it's a lot better than just going over the peer-reviewed article, because most people can't read a peer-reviewed article and most people can't understand one when it's read to them. But there's a good summary of this from a science journal called Study Shows a Direct Link Between High Consumption of Ultra-Processed Foods and Psychosocial Difficulties in Adolescence. A lot going on with adolescents these days, I think you would agree. And the consumption of ultra-processed foods is an all-time high. While the average amount of calories, at least in the United States and in other places, that a human being consumes on an average day seems to be pretty stable for the last 30 years. The amount of sugar people consume is actually down. A lot of the fat people consume is actually down. What is up are things like, plant-based fats and other like sugar and artificial sweeteners and things like that, more now than ever before. That makes sense, even anecdotally. For example, I like to riff on keto products from time to time, how keto products aren't really good for you, like a lot of like the processed ones, the keto treats, the brownies and the cookies and all that stuff, because they're about as fake as foods you can find. Look at the artificial sweeteners, and there's a whole host now of the various kinds of artificial sweeteners you can have. Apparently allulose is thought to be linked to cancer. Did you know that? Found that out recently, but it doesn't surprise me. Let's go over this story here, because as just from my anecdote, from our own little world of carb restriction, we can see that the number of processed foods that people have access to is just increasing and increasing and increasing. And people are eating less and less whole foods, to the point where a lot of people don't even know how to cook basic things anymore. Let's go over the article. Quote, adolescents who consume a greater amount of ultra-processed foods and drinks have more difficulty in terms of mental health, according to new research carried out by the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology of the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona and the Girona Biomedical Research Institute, which analyzes the habits of 500 Spanish adolescents aged between 13 and 18. The purchase of ultra-processed foods and drinks has tripled in Spain in recent decades, with adolescents being the biggest consumers of these types of industrial products, characterized by their low nutrient content, e.g. proteins and fiber, high energy densities, meaning saturated fats, the boogeyman, and added sugars, and the presence of additives, meaning colorings, flavor enhancers, that make them very attractive, tasty, and addictive. The study, which also involves the Faculty of Medicine and the Institut de Neurosciences, both at the UAB and the Barcelona Public Health Agency, analyzes the relationship between the intake of ultra-processed foods and psychosocial difficulties, such as low mood, feelings of anxiety, attentional problems, and other behavioral symptoms, taking into account the daily consumption of fruit and vegetables and the weekly physical activity of the participants, variables that have proven to have positive effects on mental health. The research showed a direct association between high consumption of ultra-processed foods and beverages, emotional distresses, and behavioral problems, with the association with low mood reported by adolescent participants being most significant. End quote. Hold on. The research didn't show a direct association. What it did show was a correlation between the data they gathered and the outcome they were testing for. That's all research like this will ever show you. But it's noteworthy nonetheless. But there are a couple caveats you should know here. I don't think I need to remind you that when you're a teenager, between the age of 13 and 18, your hormones are kind of all over the place. Teenagers are moody. We all remember our own teenage years. We don't need to go over that in too much detail. What it looks like this does is suggest that processed foods really make that process worse. Make whatever we all went through when we were adolescents, it makes it worse. It really sort of magnifies it. And now think about what's going on in the broader world. People rejecting just basic reality. People calling themselves cats now, or other weird things. Partially because they're being fed a lot of nonsense by social media and by educators who forgot that they're supposed to teach people things instead of leading them down a wrong path. Combine this with just being fed constant junk, and you begin to get the sort of a witch's brew that leads to, frankly, what looks like madness in the society. Let's continue this, though, as we explore this. Quote, adolescents reported an average consumption of 7.7 ultra-processed foods on the previous day. Wow. With higher consumption among teenage boys, 8.6 ultra-processed foods for boys compared to 7 ultra-processed foods for girls. Most participants reported consuming sausages, biscuits, processed meats, chocolate products, snacks, chocolate drinks, and sauces, up to half of them, and flavored yogurts, processed breads and pastries, sugary cereals, soft drinks, packaged fruit juices, and processed crisps, up to 40%. Well, what else is there to consume besides those things? Regarding fruit and vegetable consumption, adolescents reported an average consumption of 1.93 servings per day, far from the recommended 5 servings per day, and reported physical activity on average of 2.9 days per week. While consumption of fruit and vegetables was higher among adolescent girls, 2 servings compared to 1.7 servings for boys, boys reported higher levels of physical activity, 3.6 days compared to 2.3 days for girls. In addition, 26.2% of the participants presented some kind of psychosocial problem, 33.9% related to emotional distress, mainly depression or anxiety, 9.5% related to attentional problems, and 3.9% related to behavioral problems. In addition, by gender, girls showed greater psychosocial problems in all areas, especially in relation to low mood and feelings of anxiety, except for behavioral problems that were similar between the sexes. The association between the consumption of ultra-processed foods and mood and anxiety problems in adolescents is consistent with previous studies carried out on similar samples, explains Pietro Tonini, researcher and first author of the study, together with Marta Riels from IDIBGI, etc., etc., etc. Okay. If you want to know what you can do for your kids and for kids around you as they enter their teenage years, at the very least, get them off the ultra-processed foods. If you're not going to follow the advice that the rest of us have about going at least ketogenic, if not full zero carb, full carnivore, at least eliminate the processed foods or have them be the ultra rare treat. But otherwise, get them off that junk. It's probably going to compound whatever problems they may be dealing with coming from outside influences. You will do more good for your kids by keeping them on a whole food diet at the very least, if not going keto or even full carnivore. Studies like this are interesting because they are often done by institutions that are funded in some way from the research by the companies that they're investigating. Yet this one looks pretty honest to me. They found that eating ultra-processed foods isn't exactly good for you. Remember, this is over in Europe where Nestle reigns supreme. Anyway, I'm curious what you think of this, so let me know in the comments. I'll try to put the link to this one in the pinned comment. So look for it there. Anyway, Let me know what you think of this in the comments, please, and like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help, as does sharing this on social media. That helps too. I'm Anthony Stine, the Practical Carnivore, and thanks for tuning in today.